Hi students, it's Karen again. Today we're going to focus on the week 3 or session 3 content. So we're going to look at personality, peak performance and self-awareness in sport. So let's begin this lecture by flicking over to, I'm going to share my documents with you so you have the lecture in front of you. You should have these lecture notes available. Start. Okay, so let's start by looking at personality in sport. First, let's start with defining what personality is. And I think reflecting on yourself and asking, well, how do you describe your own personality? You know, what keywords do you use to do that? And how do you, if you were to meet somebody, what's the language that you use to describe those people? You know, what are unique characteristics to that individual? So the actual definition of personality is the sum of characteristics that makes a person unique. Whilst if I was to look at, evaluate myself and how I describe myself, I would say I'm fairly easygoing. I'd like to consider myself humorous at times. I know, though, that despite that I could be similar to other people, there are distinct differences that will exist. So no one person will have an identical set of characteristics to another person. There's always going to be something quite unique about that individual. So one of the questions that I've asked you to explore in your tutorials is, why do we need to understand personality? What's the importance of this type of research, and how do we then use that research to help us in our profession? In your tutorial content, I've actually got you to think about, well, why do you need to understand personality as a coach, teacher, or a fitness professional or trainer? So please do that. Here's a structure of personality. So Orlando in 1967 came up with this structure to describe personality. One of the basic principles that he does talk about is we have 3 levels, and this psychological core is what Orlando considers to be the most secret part of our personality. The psychological core is not necessarily something that everybody gets to see. These are your real values, your beliefs, your attitudes towards things. And as we go higher up, and I'm going to look at in the next few slides, these levels, they become more external. So our psychological core is the most hidden. Not everybody gets to see it, but as we go up through typical responses, which is how we typically behave in in situations, and then role-related behaviours. So each day I put on a different hat. I'm in here right now putting my lecture hat on. I will leave this workplace and put a sports psych hat on, and I'll keep changing the role. So I will fulfil that role by sort of identifying, well, what do I need to show for that? What are the attitudes I have to bring to the table? How professional do I need to be? What's my language going to be? So I will adapt my personality for that particular role. And then if you have a look at here, psychological core is your most constant, whereas role-related behaviours is your most dynamic. Again, as we go through the levels, we are more like in those levels, there's more changes. But to be honest, your psychological core is the real you. So let's have a look at that. So psychological core is a basic level. This is the deepest component. It's a real you. Not everybody gets to see it. This is your attitudes and your values, your interests and motives, and beliefs about yourself and your self-worth. Typical responses is then the next level. And this is how we learn to adjust to the environment. How we usually respond to the world around us. Often you'll hear of fight or flight, those kind of analogies of how do you typically respond, for example, when you're in a confrontation. Do you stand there and argue and fight, or do you walk away and avoid the confrontation? Typical responses are a good indicator of your psychological core, you're never ever going to get the whole actual real you, but they will, the way you typically respond can provide insight for people to understand the real you. So, for example, if we look at introverted versus extroverted, an introverted person likes to do things quite independently, not so outspoken in social situations, maybe at times not comfortable, whereas an extroverted person is the life of the party, loves to have a chat and doesn't mind the attention on that person. And then the final, most changeable level is role-related behaviours. So here it's about how you act based on what you perceive your social situation to be. So when I walk into the coaching realm, I play a role that I think is required for that situation. Excuse me. Different situations will require playing different roles. Like I said just earlier, in our day, we're more likely having to change our hats and do different roles throughout our day, depending on what the situation is and what leadership or what is required in that situation. So that's a funny diagram. Which of the levels of personality is the most internal and which is the most external? Which is the most stable and which is the most dynamic? The reason why I have these questions, I think one of them might be part of your model choice. So if you do go back to this structure, you can see the most internal is your psychological core, your most external is your role-related behaviours, the most unstable is your your most stable is your psychological core, and your most unstable is your role-related behaviours. Okay, now we're going to look at the viewpoints that help to understand personality and explain the concept. We have the psychodynamic approach, we have the trait approach, the situation approach, interactional approach, sorry, that should say 5, and the phenomenological approach. So the first one is the psychodynamic approach. It does have 2 themes. It really looks at placing an emphasis on the unconscious determinants of behaviour and how these conflict with the more conscious parts of one personality. If you ever have read up about psych and maybe you're familiar with Freud, he did a fair bit of work in this about the ego, the id, and so that's your conscious versus your unconscious components. It focuses on understanding the person as a whole rather than isolated traits or dispositions. However, it has had limited impact in sports psychology because it's difficult to test and it gives little attention to the social environment. It's more honed in on the person themselves. Second approach is a trait approach. And that asserts that personality traits are stable and consistent across a variety of situations. Traits predispose individuals to act a certain way regardless of the situation. So let's look at a competitive person. A competitive person is likely to be competitive regardless of the situation. But, and here's where we question whether this alone stands to explain personality. It doesn't mean that the person will always act that way. Rather, they are likely to act that way. If you think about it, I would say I'm a fairly competitive person, but when I'm playing with my niece and nephew, I have to drop that wanting to win to make sure that my niece and nephews aren't getting smashed. So you don't always, not every time in a situation does a person act a certain way because of their personality disposition. With this approach, it did have, and you might have been aware of the Big 5 model of personality. Actually, I want you to fill in a questionnaire about this. So I've got a link there for you. It looks at neuroticism versus emotional stability, extroverted versus introverted, openness to experience, agreeableness in conscientiousness. Now, do that for your own self-awareness. Like, it'd be interesting to see where you sit on those continuums. These have been identified as the most important general personality characteristics that exist across individuals. So have a go at filling that. It's a little bit lengthy, but have a go and see where you stand in terms of these 5 variables. Research findings in sports related to the trait approach, when compared to non-athletes, athletes have higher levels of extroverted. So extroversion has been considered an important trait that is more likely existent in athletes. Athletes who play high-risk sports and team sports have higher scores on extroverted subscale and lower on the conscientious subscale than those who play low-risk sports and individual sports. So people are choosing sports and engaging in a sport, and sometimes their personality characteristics do lead them to those particular events that suit their personality. Now, the limitation with the trait approach: knowing an individual's personality traits does not always help us to predict whether they will act on them. It's interesting when you see even a really aggressive football player and you take them outside of that environment. Doesn't mean that they're always going to be aggressive playing with their children or that. So it's hard to predict, and trait approach does not consider the situational influence on the behaviour. It's really just honing into personality dispositions. The third approach is the situational approach. So this says behaviour is largely determined by the situation, and that behaviour is shaped by the environmental influences and in reinforcement. So it's really looking at how our environment shapes what we do, and reinforcement also encourages or discourages further behaviour. Therefore, if the influence of the environment is too strong, the effects of personality traits is minimal. So it's kind of downplaying one's personality traits, particularly when the environmental influence is quite apparent. For example, we may be confident in one situation but tentative in another situation. Limitations about the situational approach: do people in the same situation act the same way? So again, it's when you look at those two arguments, the trait and situational, I think they both have really plausible explanations, but standing alone, they're not powerful. If you can combine them, then you've got a really good insight into why people behave a certain way and have a better understanding of their personality by looking at not just traits, but also the situation that the individual's put in. So that leads us to the interactional approach. This has a more sound, provides a more sound explanation, because we look at not just traits, but we have a look at the situation and that influence on our behaviour. So it asserts that the situation and the person are determinants of behaviour. Excuse me. This approach is widely used by sport and exercise psychologists. Whenever I work with individuals, I really want to have a good understanding of the person that's in front of me. I will explore the situation, but I also will explore the person's tendencies and traits that they make evident. It helps explain twice as many behaviours than the trait or situational approach alone. And this approach provides so much more insight for individuals who are trying to understand personality. An example of a research topic, so if you were to ask a question, you might want to look at, will introverts perform better in individual sports and extroverts in team sports? Okay, so it's looking at the social environment, but it's also looking at personality traits that could influence that particular situation. And then the phenomenological approach. This is the most popular orientation taken today. It is similar to the interactional approach. but it really hones in. So it contends that behaviour is best determined by accounting for both situations and personal characteristics. The difference between this, the interactional approach, and this approach is the psychologist examines a person's understanding and interpretation of him and herself and the environment. So you're actually really honing in perceptions. So while somebody might have a personality disposition to be really cocky and really believe, I will then hone in, well, how does the person interpret that characteristic that they have? So it taps into looking at interpretations, not just judgments of traits and situations, but the person's perception. Personality measures will be the next section that we'll have a look at. These are fun. I don't know if you've ever filled out personality measures before. I had a mate who asked me she rang me and she's really stressed, and she said, Karen, can you come over? I need you to help me fill out a personality questionnaire that she needed to do for when she was applying for a job. And I kind of said, well, I don't know what you want me to do. And she said, well, can you help me fill in the right answers? And I said, well, I don't know what the right answers are. One, I don't know what they're looking for. And two, if you fill it in and you don't actually fill it in honestly, you might line yourself up for a job that you actually don't want. I mean, the reason why business has these kind of questionnaires is to see, one, if you fit the job and if you fit the environment. So if you lie, you might end up signing up and getting a job that you're actually going to really not enjoy. And that's, basically said, look, I'm not going to help you. I think you need to fill it out really honestly, because you'll be surprised you actually don't know what they're looking for, and you might have the perfect personality for that position. But there's lots of personality measures. And the purpose of them is to examine personality traits and states. So we're looking at dispositions, and we're also looking at what you typically do in a particular situation. So traits is your typical style of behaving versus states how a situation affects behaviour. Okay, so again, it's still including that interactional phenomenological point of view where it considers traits and states, and it hones in to see what your responses are to those particular areas. So your trait areas, so we're looking over here in this square. This is looking at how you generally feel. Trait, sport, confidence inventory is an example of a questionnaire. And I'll give you an example of one of the questions. Compare your confidence in your ability to perform under pressure with that of the most confident athlete you know. So it's looking at how you generally feel. And in that, the individual will have to rate on a Likert scale from 1 to 9, where they think they fit compared to the most confident athlete. Whereas your state measures, which is over here in the more purpley colour, looks at how you feel right now. Okay, so here's an example of one of the questionnaires is a state sports confidence inventory. And a question from that inventory, compare the confidence you feel right now in your ability to perform under pressure with that of the most confident athlete you know. So it's really engaging, investigating how you feel in this situation right now. So knowing how you feel in a general game versus a finals game, and seeing if there is a difference in your confidence and how you feel right now and see yourself. So again, they've got the Likert scale from 1 to 9, and this will provide the psychologist or the person working with the athlete some insight into trait and state measures. So we have situation-specific measures. So how do you respond to this particular situation? For example, measuring how an anxious student feels before sitting an exam. So it's looking at the personality disposition of anxiety or an anxious student and how they feel right before sitting an exam. The situation-specific scale predicted anxiety levels before a student sat an exam better than a general test of state anxiety. So having a situation-specific scale that looks at how people feel right before an exam or how people feel right before a grand final gave more insight than just a general personality, a general anxiety test, and predicted behaviour a lot more sound. Sport-specific measures predict behaviour in sports settings better than general personality tests. So same with the other one. If we make it the question specific to a sport, it can allow us to predict behaviour better. For example, a sample of question from the tennis test of attentional and interpersonal style. When playing tennis, I find myself distracted by the sights and sounds around me. So ultimately, in summary, having questionnaires that are specific to either a sport or a situation allows us better insight so that we can predict behaviour. Sorry, and with that question, it's again on a Likert scale, which ranges from 0 to 4. All right, the do's and don'ts with personality testing. So you've got a activity that I actually want you to have a look at, and the basic question that I'm asking you is: will you use a psychological test to pick a team, or or to drop an athlete from a team? So you'll get to explore that, and we'll discuss that together. The do's about personality testing. So I do want you to explore. Do you think you would do this? What would you? What are some problems with it? What would you test if you wanted to test? And basically, I want you to investigate how would you utilise the information if you were to use personality tests in sports. Will you use it for selection, or would you use it for personal development? All right, so the do's when using personality tests. You need to inform participants about the purpose of the personality test and exactly how it would be used. I think back to the years of my athletic career and going into with the institute program and having to fill questionnaires, and remembering that nobody actually explained what the questionnaires were. So I got really anxious about it. And so, as any kid would do, they'll go, okay, what do I think the coach wants me to put down? And that becomes really dangerous because, again, it's not a reflection of my personality. It is a made-up person because I was too anxious about, one, I wasn't informed about what the test was for use, what the test was used for, what are they going to do with that information, who's going to see it. I had no idea. So that's really important to do. Allow only qualified individuals who have an understanding of testing principles and measurement error to give the personality test. As a coach, if you don't have training, actually as a coach, I wouldn't even give it anyway, because then I'm playing two roles. I can't have dual roles. I can't be a coach and a psychologist for a team. I can only play one of those roles. Integrate personality test results with other information obtained by the participant. So it's not just about that one pen to paper thing. Use other information, use stats, use observations of what you've seen and typical types of behaviours. It's important that you have a really complete picture of the individual. Use sport and an exercise-specific test whenever possible, giving these tests in consultation with a sports psychologist. We know, and it has said, that the sport and exercise, the more specific ones, gives us more insight in order for us to be able to predict behaviour reliably. Use both state and trait measures of personality, so don't just look at the situation and don't just look at personality, look at both. Provide participants with specific feedback concerning the results of the test. I can't tell you how many times I filled out a questionnaire and never got feedback. So what was the point of the test? I got nothing out of it, I learnt nothing from it, and I couldn't move forward with any information about developing myself. And do compare individuals against their own baselines rather than against normative information. It should be considered, and this is where the question about do I use it for selection or not, it's actually a tool for self-awareness and development. So it should be used to test and then retest in a month's time after identifying strengths and weaknesses and putting strategies in to build those weaknesses. Then I want to retest it in a month's time to see if there has been any increases in any of the variables or development. And then I want to test it again after still adding strategies and working with the individual to better psychological skills or whatever's of interest. The don'ts: don't use it. Do not use clinical personality tests that focus on abnormal results to the average pop or exercise participants, because what's going to happen is people might be influenced to answer a certain way. So you might get an abnormal result and then that person has a personality disorder, but it might not necessarily be true because that questionnaire is designed for people in that population rather than the average or sport population. Do not use personality tests to decide who makes a team or a program and who doesn't. It should be a combination of physical ability, observations that you've made, how they're performed in game situations. Have a look at the personality test, but it's not going to be a standalone predictor on whether, standalone tool of whether somebody makes a team or not. Do not give or interpret personality tests unless you are qualified to do so. And, you know, it goes back to this other idea about the clinical personality tests used in the normal pop. You're going to sometimes have results that are just, would it be outrageous or something really abnormal? So it's really important that you have the knowledge on, okay, well, what's this test doing? What do the results mean? And then how do I interpret the results and give feedback to the individual so that they can improve? And you need to be qualified to do that. Don't use personality tests to predict behaviour in sport and exercise settings without the consideration of other sources of information, such as observations, performance assessments. It can't be a standalone predictor. It must be in like a toolkit, one of the aspects that you examine, but not the only aspect. Do not breach confidentiality. It's really important that the individual feels safe. They get the feedback and they have opportunities to improve it. But this is a relationship that they share with you. And I guess as a sports side, particularly working like with programs like the Institute of Sport, I have to really communicate to coaches about confidentiality, and you won't be seeing this. What's going to happen, you know, I encourage the athlete to talk to their coach, or I encourage the athlete to talk to the coach about the strategies that we're working on rather than the results of the test. Okay, personality research. Two viewpoints in the 1960s and 70s that were apparent. First and foremost, personality is closely related to athletic success, and then the other viewpoint that personality isn't related to athletic success. So again, we're looking at whether dispositions impact somebody's ability to perform in sport. Neither standpoint has proven to be correct. Personality traits and states can predict sport and exercise behaviour and success, but there is no direct cause and effect relationship between that has been established. And that's the thing. There is no 100% this is correct answer. There's lots of relationships established, but there's no consistent direct cause and effect relationship. And then remember, personality alone doesn't account for behaviour in sport and exercise. It's actually sort of neglecting the part that situation plays in how people behave. So when we look at athletes versus non-athletes, problem with this research is, well, how do you define an athlete? Is an athlete somebody who's only at the elite level? Is an athlete who plays representative? Is an athlete somebody who is engaged in sport in a social environment? And this is where research gets a bit messy, and the reason why there is no direct cause and effect relationships, because we haven't defined what an athlete is. There is no specific personality profile that has been found to be consistent that distinguishes an athlete from a non-athlete. And again, that could go back to the fact that, well, what is an athlete? But when athletes were categorised by sports, differences did emerge. So again, maybe it's the way we're structuring the research that's causing the lack of consistency. Female athletes, when compared to female non-athletes, successful female athletes were more achievement-orientated, were independent, aggressive, emotionally stable and assertive. A few personality differences exist between male and female athletes, particularly at the elite level. So a couple of findings from looking at females in sport. Then we have the Morgan's mental health model, the iceberg profile. And this looks at successful athletes, this looks at different moods and where somebody sits with regards to those moods. What they have found is successful athletes display greater positive mental health than less successful athletes. So if we have a look at vigor, successful athletes sit quite high on that, and they'll sit low on the negative types of mood states, mental health, so tension, depression. So when they had done the outline of what this graph looks like, it looks like an iceberg. So it can predict athletes who score above the norm on the profile of mood states for vigor and below the norm for the other variables will more likely be successful. And that makes sense. However, evidence does not justify using this instrument as a basis for selecting teams, and a user must be mindful of athletes faking good. And that's where this iceberg data might come unstuck if people are faking. So faking the negative mood states and the positive mood states, so they're misreporting it. And then if you use that to select a team, it's not going to give you, we need to make sure that we consider observations, game experience, all that stuff needs to come into play to do that. It should be used as a tool to monitor the athlete's mindset rather than a selecting tool. Okay, on to the next section. So we're now going to have a look at psychological characteristics of peak performance. Not sure if any of you have experience being in the zone. Often you hear when people talk about those who have experienced a peak performance, they're in the zone, they're on fire, they're hot, whatever it is. These are basically your magical moments, your magic moments when the athlete puts it together both physically and mentally. Something about this situation is you won't be able to experience a peak performance unless your physical abilities match the demands of the sport. So if you haven't got the physical capabilities to perform in that particular situation, then you're not going to experience a peak performance. This gives you mental control when you match the physical situation, and that's when you can experience peak performance. So I just want to note that, because sometimes I hear people who say, oh, I was on fire today, blah, blah, blah. But I'm like, well, how can you be on fire? Your physical skills aren't efficient or adequate for that particular sports situation. I've mentioned this in, I think, week 1. We had a look at, athletes and coaches. They actually acknowledge that 40 to 90% of success in sport is due to mental factors, and that as your skill level increases, the mental aspects of performance become more important. And it goes back to that principle. When you get to the elite level, athletes tend to be matched physically. So really the only difference between, like I said in the other lecture, unless you're Usain Bolt and you're just naturally a freak and gifted, it generally will come down to the athlete's mental prep, their mood states, their way they see themselves, their confidence, their concentration. Those aspects will all become more and more important as they get to the elite level because their physical skills are matched. So whoever can get that mental game packaged and delivered well is the one who's more likely going to be successful. Let's have a look at a bit of the research. Questions that are important that have been investigated. Is there an optimal psychological state for peak performance? Do I need to do certain things psychologically to be in that moment? And then can we train athletes to consistently produce peak performances or perform closer to their optimal? So really, when we look at that research about peak performance and get information from athletes about this and coaches, we're looking at, can we answer those two? Is there something we need to do psychologically to get there? And can I train athletes to be as close to their peak performance or optimal levels as possible? Research doing this, they used a number of methods to do this, to identify psychological characteristics underlying successful performance. One of the methods that they used was, went, all right, you got a gold medal, sit down, let's have a chat, and tell me what happened. Tell me how you prepped for it, what were you thinking, how were you feeling, what was your strategy, and the researcher will explore and identify, okay, this is what the individual did psychologically to get into, to be able to perform at their peak. Another method that was used was research asking elite performers, coaches, psychs and scouts about what they think it takes to be successful in sport. And here we're looking at more qualitative research than quantitative. Another method that was used was looking at emotional states associated with best and worst performances. So they would get the athlete to indicate the emotional state, so whether there was an anxiety or mood state questionnaire prior to performance, and then they would perform. So they would collect data over many games or a season or over an important period, and they will match, okay, well, and see if there was any pattern with mood states and what influenced the best and worst performances. The next method they used was to identify mental prep strategies and psych strategies. So mainly probably working with the athletes themselves, asking what do they do, and then working with the psychs as well to say, okay, well, if an athlete is to prep for and have their best performance, what do they need to do? And then the last one that they have used, the method, was looked at successful and less successful athletes and basically examined what the differences were in their prep, their thinking. So kind of like the athlete recall, but more so doing a comparison with successful versus less successful athletes. To conclude, here's what they found about the successful athlete. They're high in self-confidence and expectations of success. They can regulate themselves. They can control their arousal. They can be energized, but they're still relaxed. They are in control. They feel they are in control. They have complete concentration. They know what cues to pay attention to in their environment. They have a keen focus on the present task, which is often an error for athletes, is focusing on past or future events or thoughts. Doesn't allow you to focus on the right cues at the time. So they're mindful of the situation and what's presented in front of them, and they are actively working with that situation. They view difficult situations as challenges rather than setbacks, and like to attack them. They productively are perfectionists. They have high standards. They have positive attitudes and thoughts about performance. When they think about themselves or see themselves perform, it's always a positive experience. And they have strong determination and obviously commitment. I mean, working with this cycle of Olympians going through, knowing their stories. In fact, this morning I had two of my athletes just burst into tears. They're exhausted because they're just about to get on the plane to go to Rio. And we're talking about their journey. My God, they had so much determination and so much commitment, what they sacrificed, the effort, the humiliation at times, the put downs. They are so strong, and it was so great to see that they made the team. But the hard thing right now is, okay, we've made the team. Now it's about, and we're going to keep working on this and set new goals. What are you going to do whilst you're in the team? So I really respect athletes, particularly at that elite level, and how much they give for their sport. Some of the mental skills that are associated with peak performance that athletes do use, they use imagery, they goal set, they have thought control strategies, they use arousal management strategies, so they can psych up when they have to, but they can also relax when they need to. They have developed competition plans. They're ready for anything, short warm-ups, too much warm-up, weather, all that kind of stuff. They practice coping skills so they become automatic. They do the what ifs prior to the event. They don't go in there and then get smacked with something that's out of their control and they didn't know it was coming. They're actually prepped for it, and they have practiced or developed coping skills before the event. So when they get confronted with adverse things, they don't freak out. And that was one of the big, reflecting back on one of the PD events that I did, speaking about London Olympics and how Great Britain performed and how different their performance was compared to the Australian athletes. And the one thing that the sports science, in fact, I think the Australian sports science said is that they planned for the what ifs. They were ready for anything. So when adverse things came up, they didn't choke, and they were able to go, oh, okay, this is tough, but I've got skills to get me through this. Whereas our Aussie athletes going into London, many of them weren't prepped for some of the circumstances that are thrown in. So when they experience that adverse thing, they were thrown. And then that then distracts them from performance, and then that then leads to not your best performance. They enjoy competitive simulation. They create the environment that they're going to experience in competition, and they practice it. So simulation training. I mean, one of the best ways to talk about that is, if you think about astronauts, they go into a simulator and they practice as if they're in space. Athletes do this all the time. They practice, what if you're 5 points down, got 1 minute left, how are you going to get through it? We're up by 1 point, how we're going to hold on to it, and practicing those simulations. They've got good attention control, and they can develop, and they have developed refocusing skills and plans for when they get distracted. And you know what? They're going to get distracted. So you are naive to think that that's not going to happen. So for me, working with my athletes, it's like, sweet, right? One of the main reasons why we lose distraction often is a mistake. So we have a plan of attack for when they make a mistake, that they address the mistake, find out what's wrong, visualize it, doing it perfectly, takes a breath, lets it go, and moves on to the next cue, most important point, finding my player, or running the floor, or whatever it is that they need to do. How can you identify performance level? Key strategy, and you might want to write about this in your essay, is self-awareness. You can't do anything unless you're aware of what you're doing right now. So if you are to implement any strategies in your own life or into the life of somebody else, you have to be aware of what you're doing right now. primary goal in performance enhancement is to teach athletes to recognise, increase awareness of the psychological skills that help them gain control. What I need athletes to be able to do is be aware of their own ideal performance state. What does it feel like when everything's going right? What's their arousal level like? What are they thinking? What are they focused on? How are they feeling? And then I need them to be able to then compare their current performance to that ideal state, and so that they can keep checking in and going, oh, okay, my thoughts are a bit flat. I've got to change them because when I was performing really well, this is what I was thinking. So being able to get this information, and then every time you play, you compare this state to that state, and then you can identify, oh, the difference. I'm not as energized, so I need to do some psych up strategies. Why is awareness important? Revisa and FIFA state that athletes are only in the zone 10 to 20% of the time. I spoke about that recently with some of the girls going to Rio. I was talking about, don't be upset when you don't have 40 or 60 minutes of performance in the peak. You're actually not, you're only in there for 10 to 20% of the time. And same with Lou Pinella. It says, you know, why do athletes get so disappointed when they're a little off? One of the best things I've learned being a sports psych is this, and it comes from just this one statement: the player must learn to feel comfortable about being uncomfortable. And this is where that strategy of practice the what ifs, if this happens, this bad thing happens, how am I going to cope? You have to learn to be comfortable about being uncomfortable. So if you hate final series, you need to simulate what it's like with a crowd and all that stuff, so that when you get to finals, you've practiced it at training already, which unfortunately is never going to be an ideal replica. But at least you'll have thought about, oh, I'm starting to, you know, not breathe properly. I'm getting nervous, I'm shaking or whatever. So you experience the symptoms, and then you can come up with some strategies to control that before you go over the edge and you can't return. Practicing adversity is really important, practicing dealing with it. It helps the athlete to be confident that if they do experience some type of adversity, that they can cope, and knowing that they do not have to feel great to perform well. How many times have you performed well, but it was still, you know, you weren't feeling great about the situation? So learning to deal with adversity prepares athletes to approach these situations with confidence and focus. For example, like I said about the simulators, for those going to NASA, in a space, that's quite an intense environment. In fact, I think they need to learn to attend to 7 different things at the same time, which is just such a phenomenal capability to be able to train yourself to do that. Right. So what do you need to be aware of? You need to know what your strengths are and your weaknesses. In fact, I don't use the word weaknesses with athletes. I always talk about things to improve on. You need to maximise your strengths. So the language that I use with my athletes, even this morning, was just saying, what's your weapons? What are you going in there with? How are you going to make sure you get court or pool time? You've got to really back yourself. And I always encourage athletes, whenever you go to a game or an event, you don't go in with your weaknesses. You go in with your strengths. So I know as a basketball player, I could shoot really well, and I was really smart. So it didn't matter how fast you were, I could still stop you. I went into games with that. The bit about not being as quick or jump as high as the other girl was what I took to training to practice. But you go in the game with your strengths and then correct your weaknesses. So being able to identify what's working and making it stronger, but also what's not working and how do I fix it. Once you do that, then the next question is, what would be a good performance enhancement strategy to implement at this next stage? And then that will be goal setting. You can't do any other strategy unless you're aware first. Here's some techniques on how you become more self-aware. In fact, I think I've got a Scout report for you guys that you can fill out, Scout report. And I like this tool because it pulls you outside from the athlete mode into the coach's mode, and it makes you look at yourself externally. And so for this is like, well, why would a coach pick me? What am I doing well, and what do I need to work on? I feel at times it gives the athlete a chance to put themselves in the coach's shoes and pull out stuff that they probably wouldn't pull out if I just asked them to tell me what your strengths and weaknesses were. Group discussions are good, as long as they're controlled, particularly for negative conversations that might need to be, challenging issues. With a group discussion, have rules around it, but it's really quite wonderful at times when in the group discussion that your team lets you know that you're contributing something that you weren't aware of. I find that really, really valuable, because people walk out of meetings and go, I didn't know I did that. That's really good, and I feel part of the team. So group discussions can sort of devolve that information. Feedback sheet on performance. So just a quick sheet at the end where they fill it out, whether it's about stats and that, but also you could measure some psychological variables, how well I felt during the game, what were my thoughts, were they positive or negative, that kind of questioning. Imagery is really helpful. Imagery is used, and I've used it with many athletes, but often when people can't explain to me what happened, I will then do an imagery script. So for example, I had a sprinter and she was trying to explain why she performed so badly, but couldn't. So I got her to close her eyes and think about the marshalling area, what she was looking at, what she was paying attention to, and we went all the way through, and I could actually see symptoms start. She went red, she started to shake while we went through this. And it was a really good exercise to identify the symptoms, but also to identify the trigger. Now, what actually happened was when she was in the marshalling area, she was so focused on this really tall 6 foot something girl who was so much taller than her, instead of her race plan. So when she got to the lane and she knelt down ready to do her start, she said, my only thought was, oh my God, her legs are so long, her stride, she's going to smash me. And that's it, race gone. She's not thinking about a race plan, she's thinking about something that's out of her control and completely irrelevant information. So that was a useful strategy. Some athletes like a sports journal. Personally, as an athlete, I hated it. But I have some athletes who love it, and it's great as a sports night because they write so much stuff. They come to me and they're ready to have a conversation about it. For those who don't like writing too much, then it's just 3 points on what's working, 3 points that's not working, and what's your goals for the next day, and what have I learnt from the situation. So you can do that. You can monitor physiological systems. Some of the sports have quite a bit of money, so they can fund putting equipment on athletes. AFL do a good job of that, tracking the distances, heart rates. It'd be interesting to see when somebody completely misses, say, for example, a big shot or a field goal under pressure, what their physiological system was doing. Was their heart rate up? Was their muscles tense? That kind of stuff. And then you could also just do psychological questionnaires, which you will be doing. I've got a couple of questionnaires for you throughout the course. That stuff can give you information about your experience psychologically, what your skills are like, how you're coping, and like I said, we'll explore a few of the concepts, such as we'll have a look at arousal, concentration, and that kind of stuff. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed that lecture. That's a little bit of insight. I'll just stop sharing my screen when I can see it. Okay, hopefully that gives you some insight into personality, peak performance, and self-awareness in sport. I do want to highlight that you need to be self-aware before you can make any changes in your life. So make sure you go through a process whereby you go, what's going on? Okay, what happened in the experience? What was I thinking? What were my distractions? All those kind of thoughts, so that you then have great information, so then you can identify what strategies you should put in place. Okay, so I will see you at some stage this week to talk about, to have a Google Hangout with you. Before that, make sure you fill out any of the activities that I've assigned for you to do, and then we can just discuss them. Okay, chat to you soon. Bye.